Hi, and welcome back to the Offset Podcast. This is part one of a two-part series where we'll be talking with Nate McFarlane from Dolby. Over these next two episodes, we'll talk with Nate about his engineering background, his role at Dolby, and of course, we'll be exploring the Dolby Vision ecosystem in detail. Stay tuned.
This episode is sponsored by our friends Flanders Scientific, who are leaders in color-accurate display solutions for professional video. Whether you're a colorist, editor, DIT, or broadcast engineer, Flanders Scientific has professional display solutions to meet your needs. Learn more at flandersscientific.com. Hey guys, I'm Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Joey Deanna.
And welcome back to another show. And Joey, this week we're talking about something that I think to all of those who have met us, know us, have been unfortunately stuck in a cab with us or something similar, know that we like to talk about a lot. And I mean a lot, underline that, bold it, exclamation point at the end. And that is Dolby Vision, right? Dolby Vision is a technology platform, whole deal from the guys at Dolby, and it's often paired with another related technology, which is called Dolby Atmos. And both of these technologies, I don't know, I think first came to my mind probably in the 2015, 16-ish range, maybe a year or two plus or minus from there. And you know, at the time we were just coming off of the PTSD that was stereoscopic 3D projects, right? And all that entailed. And it was like, oh, finally, we're back to regular, old, boring SDR television. And then what happened? We got this bug and we got bit by this thing called Dolby Vision and HDR. And literally for the past 8 years, it's not been, you know, that's all we think about and talk about and do, right?
Yeah. And I think, you know, a big part of that is the image quality behind it. Right.
Yeah.
We both, I think, kind of saw stereoscopic in television, at least, as kind of gimmicky. You know, we've talked at length about higher resolutions and frame rates being kind of gimmicky as well. You know, in any reasonable screen size and viewing distance combination, a human being can't perceive the difference between, say, UHD or 4K and HD. But and I think a lot of people were expecting the next jump in image quality to be analogous to when we went from SD to HD. But even when we went from SD to HD, we didn't really improve colorimetry, overall image quality, dynamic range. We just made the resolution bigger. This, when HDR came and Dolby Vision came into our world, it was kind of, it's an entirely new way of encoding, transmitting, and displaying an image that allows us to have such a higher perceived level of quality and accuracy that it just, both of us got immediately excited by the possibilities, because you can't look at it and not
be impressed by it, right?
Like,
yeah.
If it's your first, I mean, at this point, most people have seen HDR, but everybody, when they see HDR for the first time, it's like when they saw HD TV for the first time. It's just that drastic.
We use that phrase a lot of better pixels, and I think that, you know, as a catch-all for what HDR and specifically Dolby Vision is doing, I would include Atmos, but that's not pixels, that's sound waves. But in general, it's better core technology. It's better pixels, better audio. It's and we use a lot of different analogies that I'm sure we'll talk about today. But you know, the wide end of the funnel, it's the most bits, or whatever you want to throw, whatever way you want to say it. It allows you to kind of master at the best possible technical quality and go from there. And yeah, I mean, right around that time we got interested in it, and we were lucky enough, you and I, to both be writers and presenters for a series that the Dolby Institute did. We got hired by the guys at the Dolby Institute to do a primer on Dolby Vision. And this was kind of, you know, again, the early days of Dolby Vision. And we were lucky enough to do that. And that was really kind of the bug kind of got planted in us. And through that, we were able to obviously carry on to do a bunch of HDR projects. And we remained close with the guys at Dolby to the point where we'd like to talk to them all the time. We're on their podcast. They're now on our podcast. And to that end, we are very lucky today to have a good friend and I would just say one of the smartest people I know, Nate McFarlane from Dolby. Nate, welcome to the Offset Podcast. We're super glad to have you, man.
Hey, Robbie, Joey, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. Can't wait to chat. And we need to hire you guys again. That was such a great pitch. I love it. I don't even need to talk.
I don't think either one of us would say no to that opportunity. So let's make it happen. So Nate is a senior content engineer over at Dolby. He specializes in commercial partnerships, which means that he is talking to the likes of Sony and LG and FSI and Canon and all the partner companies that are out there, that are in the general, kind of the Dolby Vision ecosystem. But I guess, Nate, let's, before we get into all the particulars of, Dolby Vision and, all that kind of stuff, I just want to know, like, who you are, what's your background, how did you get here, what's this path? I mean, because I think that we are so used to talking about and talking to people on our end of the industry, right? The creatives, the button pushers, the people stuck in suites, that I
Sure.
think it's, this kind of like what you do and what your team does is kind of like this ambiguous thing, right? It's kind of like, oh yeah, those are just the guys at Dolby, and we don't really quite understand all of that. And I mean, from talking to you over the years, I know, and some of your colleagues too. I mean, it's kind of a mix of science and math and technology and customer
Absolutely.
service and all of that. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Dolby and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I can give the 20-foot background. So I first kind of became interested in the whole like film industry when honestly I was in like middle school and high school, right around the time YouTube started to become like a big
Mm.
scene. And I was really into kind of, like sort of short film sci-fi stuff. Like I'm a big Star Wars nerd. I'm a Trekkie. And I followed a few folks back in the day that would do that sort of,
Like fan film kind of things.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely
yeah.
on YouTube. But I always kind of found myself being more interested when they would put out like weeks after the actual film would be released, the kind of behind the scenes, like technical stuff. And I always thought post-production was super cool. And then I started following people like Freddie W and Video Copilot, like Andrew Kramer's awesome, and getting really into kind of that side of the fence. And I still remember, I think I was like a sophomore or junior in high school when my dad first bought me my first like DSLR, and I was so pumped, and I would just run around and, shoot little goofy videos with my friends at the time. So when it came time to kind of look for colleges, initially I was kind of thinking more of that traditional film route. But
Mm.
I was also kind of had a pretty, vested interest in kind of math and science as well as my background. And my father actually worked at a university with this big tuition exchange list at the time. And so we would go through all these different schools. And one of the ones that had popped up that actually my brother had visited years in past that he didn't end up going to was RIT, or Rochester Institute of Technology. And when we were doing some more digging there, they had this really cool kind of groundbreaking, honestly, program called Motion Picture Science, which
Yeah, yeah.
on paper sounded like the best of both worlds. And so you'll hear me refer to that as MPS going forward just because it's easier as an acronym. But MPS is really cool in that it kind of bridges that creative and technical gap, like you were just talking about, Robbie, in the sense that you do get kind of traditional film, classes like production, scripting, things like that. But then you also get on the engineering side, more of the scientific foundation, things like optics, radiometry, color science,
Totally.
sensor design, all the things that kind of make that film industry tick. And it's kind of been awesome to go through that. And it was a really, really tight-knit group of people. They only let in 15 students every year.
Oh, wow.
And usually by the time you graduate, it's dropped down. So I think in my graduating class, I want to say there was maybe 9 or 10 of us.
Wow.
But it's been really cool. It's really kind of a new program. I believe the first graduating class was in 2010 or 11, I believe. And it was started by a couple of ex imaging engineers at Kodak, actually, right? So it worked out really well. And it's been really cool since I graduated in 2016, which I'm now realizing is a lot longer ago than it feels like. But it's really cool because in this industry, you guys know, obviously, it's a fairly niche industry compared to a lot of other fields, but it's really awesome to see how often I interact with other RIT grads. I mean, I think we
Yeah.
have at least 7 or 8 of us at
Well,
Dolby.
I was gonna say, I mean, the funny thing about this, Nate, is that like I feel that everybody that I know that legitimately calls themselves an color scientist, and let's be clear, there's plenty of people who call themselves color scientists who have no
Sure.
formal education about this, but the
Yeah.
actual color scientists that I know, they all went to RIT,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And they all have this math background and stuff like that, and it's like it's gotten to the point where it's just like if somebody says color scientist, the next thing out of my mouth is, so did you go to RIT? And almost every time the answer is yes, I went to RIT, and
That's
then
awesome.
they know you and
Sure.
Molly Hill and all these colleagues of yours. Oh yeah, sure, good friends with them. So
Yeah.
that small world is it. But like, let me ask you a little bit about that experience because I think this is something that many of our listeners might not be aware of because I think that traditional film school route, as you mentioned, kind of whether it be the writing part of it or the producing part of it or the technical part of like we do as colorists, that's more familiar. But like, I think one of the questions I had was that I was terrible at math in high school, right?
Sure.
Like I got like D's in math, but I was good at science, right? I was good like when the math was applied, so like
Sure.
physics, chemistry, that kind of stuff. I was good. To those, maybe if some of our younger listeners or people who have kids that are maybe about to go college age, like is that a barrier to success at a school like RIT? Like if I am just like a little math phobic, but I hear it's all about math, like is there a place for me there? Like could I make it in a school like that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, RIT definitely, I mean, I won't lie and say that it's not like an engineering technical focused school. So I think the baseline kind of math prerequisites for the MPS program, for example, are just calc and physics. And a
Yep.
lot of that you get, I took both. I took calc as an AP in high school, but then I actually took it again just to get a refresher during college. And the physics, was relatively not too crazy, and you're kind
Yeah.
of those are the good thing about those are kind of more general elective classes, so you're in a big class and you have a lot of people to kind of help you out with. I'd actually argue that it gets a little more scary when you actually get into like the core things like radiometry,
Oh,
optics,
sure.
Fourier math type things that sound super scary, and rightfully so they are. But it's funny because you'll realize that when you get into the real world, depending on the path you take, like
Yeah.
I can't tell you the last time I thought about Fourier mathematics, right? Like it never enters my brain, and I'm happy.
Well, see, Joey, on the other hand,
I,
he audits classes at like MIT and stuff with Fourier transforms and whatnot. Like, didn't you just take a nuclear physics class, Joey, like at MIT or something?
I did. Well, yes and no. I'll say this slightly off topic, but somewhat on topic is MIT, not RIT,
Yeah.
has a very cool online program where their advanced classes are just given out to the public and you can download videos of all the lectures, all the assignments and everything. So if you are looking at getting some science education, that's a cool thing as well. But yeah, I love that stuff, and I was bad at math too.
Yeah.
Uh, my brother is a basically career mathematician, computer scientist at a very very high level, and he used to always say, still says basically, that nobody's actually bad at math. There's just a lot of really really bad math teachers,
Okay.
Sure.
and I kind of believe that because it was
I'll
never
go with that one.
presented to me in a way that got me interested.
Yeah.
And now, as an adult, I'm looking at a lot of things that I find really, really interesting that have mathematical basis to them, and wishing I had learned more fundamental math, calculus, differential equations, stuff like that, trigonometry. You know, I wish I had taken that much more seriously when I was younger, getting that foundational knowledge. Because now I'm like, well, this actually can lead me into some really
Well,
fascinating
that sounds like me. Like
stuff I'm into.
I buy these books, right? Like color science books, and like I'm thinking like Charles Poynton or whatever, right?
Mark
And it's
Fairchild,
like,
things like
and
that.
I get into them and I'm all stoked about them, and it's like I get through. Then I open the book and I realize that like there's only actually about 800 words in the book, right? The rest of it is just your math. And so I think that it's interesting that you had that experience because I think that one of the scary things for people who admire that level of knowledge is the math part about it. And I think that, having come to know you and some of your colleagues over the years, it's really interesting that like, for the average colorist, it's not about necessarily mastering that math, right? It's more about being understanding the higher level version of it, the general flow of it, but nobody's asking us to go out and win the Fields Medal as a colorist and understand,
Yeah, and I think
every
that's a
bit of it.
really important distinction to draw, is because, like you said, I get into these scientific hobbies of researching this stuff a little bit, and I wouldn't say I can do any of the math. Like if you were to put in front of me formulas to derive and actually figure out usable solutions to measure data and stuff like that, I would be lost. But if you ask me some of the more fundamental questions of what does this represent and why does this happen, I can get a pretty good understanding of
Yeah.
it. So there's kind of that gradient there.
Yeah, that's very
I
cool.
think that's a really important distinction to make though too, is that like being creatives that understand that at like a very high level is super valuable. And I will say to your point, Robbie, there's like a black hole of knowledge that you could go down. Whereas like, it's funny because I have, friends that were close colleagues of mine at RIT that I know very well that are now like imaging vision scientists at Apple or Netflix. And, we have some, like Jacqueline Pitlars is one that comes to mind, who's like a brilliant, accomplished color scientist and vision researcher on Dolby staff. And, her level of color science compared to me, even though we went through the same curriculum, is like
Yeah,
levels of
yeah.
difference, right? All these different, focus areas you could go. RIT actually, the only color science I took at RIT was just kind of the required core material, but they actually have a whole master's and even a PhD program if you really wanted to go down the rabbit hole of color science, which I have, I have friends like I think of like Ben Bodner comes to mind, and
Yeah, sure.
like LG Apple, who did the masters, and he's a great and one of the smartest guys I know. So it's really kind of you can choose your own destiny kind of thing with that degree, which I think is really cool. I mean, we have people that went, did the scientific MPS bachelor's degree, but then still ended up doing, like creative filmmaking careers, right? So
I'm sure that technical background is a very good foundation for them.
Absolutely. No, and that was kind of the whole mantra when we were learning, is that like, hey, this is a really tight-knit group. This is a family here. And if you really kind of focus and do the due diligence, like this is going to set you so far ahead, when
Yeah.
you graduate. And it's really cool to see now that companies, source RIT grads very aggressively, and to the point now where, because so many of us have gone through the curriculum now some of the older alums are in hiring positions that will hire straight from RIT, right? So it's kind of it's been really cool to see that. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I laugh at how often that I run into RIT grads. I mean, like I think of like every time I talk to the Netflix guys, right? Like 3 out of the 4 people on their imaging team are RIT grads, right? So it's cool to see, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's also just very cool to me that background. I mean, obviously, I've expressed to you before. It's something that I kind of admire. Like, I want more of that in my life. But the more that I think about it, it's also for those who might be thinking about going down that path. I think the program that you did and the way that you've described it here and have described it to me in the past is really interesting, because it is that morph of kind of creative and technical. I think about what's his name? Joseph Slumka, is that his name?
Yeah, photochem.
Yeah, at Photochem, who's a color scientist, and just thinking about his interaction with some of the top colorists in the world, right? And like what those discussions must be like back and forth between him and DPs and gaffers and him and colorists, and like that creative calibration that exists simultaneously with the math and the science and all that kind of stuff is pretty fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely encourage people to check out the RIT program. So you did RIT, then what happened? Where'd you go after that?
Yeah, sure. So I graduated in 2016. My thesis was actually involved, it was called resolution enhancement via display vibration. So my partner Max and I thought it would be cool to stick a motor on the back of a display, vibrate it really fast, and run a bunch of psychophysical experiments to see if it actually could give off the perception of higher resolution, which we joke about nowadays, because that core idea is actually in a lot of products nowadays. It's like
I was going to ask, did it?
So pixel shift projectors, you might have heard of that.
Sure.
Similar concept. But yeah, no, that went really well. So senior year was awesome. And then actually both of us got hired together to go to IMAX in LA. So we worked on their post-production mastering team. So again, when I, went through RIT, I was thinking that, I kind of want to go the more, generic film route, right? And do kind of the whole post-production visual effects. That was still kind of where a lot of my core interests lie. But with my thesis, I was kind of diving more into like the display technology standpoint. So I worked for IMAX for a year, did a lot of the mastering for them, got to work on some really cool projects. That was 2016 and 2017. So that was like the year of Rogue One and Doctor Strange, like some really cool movies that came out that we were able to work on there. And then a year later, I actually got my job at Canon. So I was there for 4 years, but that was really cool. And that completely shifted my direction from post-production, now more hardware focused, where things like calibration and instrumentation tuning and repair, like all became very prevalent. And wouldn't trade my time at Canon for the world. Got to travel the world, meet some really cool people. And again, to your point earlier, Robbie, it was a lot of this kind of intersection of, how do we best make hardware that meets the creative's needs, and being able to kind of talk that talk and have more of the, I joked by the time I left, I felt like I was wearing two hats, where I was an engineer on, by training, but kind of an account manager by necessity, right? Where,
Yeah,
I
right.
was always going on these like sales calls and demos and got to meet some really awesome people. And then in 21, just after COVID, there was actually a vacancy at Dolby for someone on the commercial partnerships team, which I am on now. And they were looking for someone with display technology, calibration experience. And I remember telling my wife at the time, I'm like, this would be silly for me not to apply. Like, it just is such a
Right,
good
right.
fit.
Such a good fit, yeah.
And so I've been here for 3 years, and I absolutely love it.
So what's day to day like then for you at Dolby? I mean, obviously you're, just to let everybody know, I got to spend a quality amount of time with Nate at this past year's NAB. We were both sitting in a, how should we say, extremely small room slash booth.
A
That was
comfy
sort of
room.
an offshoot from the Flanders Scientific booth, and we are talking about displays and color management and stuff, which was a lot of fun. But like, I know you travel a lot. You're at trade shows, talking to partners and stuff. Like, but what's your average day at Dolby like? What are you doing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I kind of wear multiple hats, and it's very similar to how it was at Canon for me, actually, where again, a lot of my background and day-to-day tasks are kind of more engineering related around Dolby Vision support. How does the algorithm work? How can we improve that? Talking to customers, but the core of what we do is support. So again, a lot of training education initiatives we're constantly building. We're in a really cool spot right now where HDR and Dolby Vision is growing at like a crazy fast
Right.
pace, and the momentum there is ever increasing. So we're really looking at how can we kind of scale this sort of knowledge that we have, because again, it is, like you guys said, it's kind of these niche field and set of algorithms and things that guide our processes, but just disseminating that information into very digestible things as we continue to scale into new markets like social media and education and all
Yeah,
these
yeah.
different intersections. I mean, we have Dolby Vision in cars now, which is just crazy to even
nuts.
think about. So we have a lot of cool momentum there, but that requires really, a lot of, you know, differentiation in the way we've done training, because speaking to what you said earlier in the podcast, is like back in 2015, 2016, it was so new that it was all kind of very white glove, in the sense that we would take pulsars around, and for those who are not aware,
Let's start there. I mean, I think
Sure.
it's a good segue into kind of like a little bit about the origins of DV, where it is currently, where it's going. Because I mean, I think there's a lot of people, believe it or not, who are just getting into DV, even though it is a little more mature. It's mature now compared to where it was. And Joey and I, as we said when we started off the show, we got interested in it because of two things. It was kind of like we saw kind of the path of like, nah, this is the next big thing, because we saw it and we were floored by it. But we started getting to Joey. I'm trying to remember about this a little bit, because it was a while back, but I remember. I think I had first heard of Brightside Technologies, which was research going down this avenue of, looking into HDR displays. And just to be clear, I think that HDR is something for a lot of people that is not new per se. And what I mean by that is HDRI, HDR imaging has been around for a long time, where we take, multiple exposures of something, we merge them together to have kind of the
An
perception,
ugly SDR image.
the perception in a higher dynamic range, but we're still forcing it down a standard dynamic range pipe. And it seems like, initially Brightside, and then when Dolby acquired some of that technology and continued on with a lot of the research, which, by the way, I get $5 for every time I say this, but I think a lot of people think about Dolby as like just like a licensing company, and that's certainly part of your guys' business model, but at their heart, it's a research and development company, right? And I think that was really interesting when Brightside was acquired, and you guys had some of this technology now, and the work that went on. I think from talking to some of your colleagues over the years, and kind of the mandate was, we need to create technologies that better imitate or replicate the real world viewing experience, right? Like when you go outside and it's a bright sunny day and you're seeing chrome coming off a bumper at 9 bajillion nits, right? Like eventually we can get that. And also recognizing that where we've been to date with SDR television has been very limited, right? And I remember, this is when I started getting into this. I remember being at NAB one year giving some classes at Post Production World, which is a big conference. And somebody came up to me and afterwards like, hey, I was just down on the show floor and I didn't see, you were talking about HDR, but I didn't see any HDR cameras. When are those coming out? Right. And I kind of gave the guy a side eye, and I'm like, they're already out. And he's like, what do you mean they're already out? I'm like, every camera that you record, like the camera wars, right? Everybody's, well, we're 15 stops, we're 16 stops, we're all, I'm like, so those cameras have been able to do that for the longest time. Yet
HDRs existed in the camera space since the 1800s.
right, exactly. So
Absolutely.
I started getting into it, and I think I want to start this part of the conversation at something you hinted at a minute ago, is that in 2015, 16, 17, that range there, I got the impression that Dolby Vision was very, I like to say this in a fun way and hopefully not disparaging way to Dolby, but it was a country club technology. And what I mean by that was that, like, only the top facilities in the world were doing Dolby Vision or HDR in general, because it was this technology that was very heavily, I don't know what's the word, Joey, curated by you guys, I guess, right?
Sure.
And you guys, there was a lot of decisions about who's going to be able to get this and who's going to be able to use it. And I'm thinking of, you know, the Photochems, the eFilms, the Company Threes, you know, all those kind of big time players, right? So what happened? Like, was that a testing ground for Dolby Vision? Like I'm a little, that's part of the history of Dolby Vision I'm a little vague on, right? Is that like, it sort of makes sense to put this technology in the best hands of the best people in the world, but how did it eventually get out to the wider world? You know, what's the history there?
Yeah, no, great question. And my colleagues Tom and Avi, who are involved from the get-go, could probably give a better perspective than I. But I would actually back it up even a little more than 2015 and say kind of with the advent of PQ, and I believe, if I'm remembering my signature, that was 2014. So Dolby did a lot of research into, you know, how the human eye perceives things. Like, again, you mentioned, you know, almost everything we do is perception based, in the sense that we want things to mimic the human interaction that you perceive in the real world. So I can give you guys some great images for this, but we have these really cool labs in San Francisco that'll measure all sorts of human brain waves, interactions, things like that when displayed with certain kinds of content. So, you know, an analogy and example we like to show here is like, for HDR, for example, some of the very, very early prototypes of HDR reference displays, like the Pulsar and things that we were building at the time, where we would sit somebody down in a chair, connect a bunch of, you know, brainwave monitoring machines, blast them with really bright content. And one thing that we found, again, is that for a fire, for example, we would show something that was brighter than traditional SDR. And we found that there was actually a very real visceral reaction of people where their skin started to get perspiration and things like that, where they're actually, you know, viscerally reacting as if they're actually getting heat off of this fire, which of course we know is not actually the case, you know, aside from the heat of the monitor.
I'm about to say, with the Pulsar, it might be.
Right. Like the Pulsar maybe, but you know what I mean? So a lot of that was done early on, but then it almost became kind of a, okay, we've convinced ourselves, right? But now we have to go show this to the people that are making all of the best content in the world, right? Like all these big post-production studios that you mentioned. And at the time, again, not only was it a kind of a knowledge gap where anyone outside of Dolby didn't really understand how to do it, but there wasn't a lot of hardware, right? Like HDR reference displays didn't exist at this time. And that's why Dolby said, screw it, we'll do it ourselves. We'll build one. So we prototyped, there was a display called the Pulsar, which was a behemoth of a display. There's only, I believe there was only 20 that were made. There's actually only 2 that are still left in the field from the last time I checked, but really cool display, but required a ton of additional power, 4,000 nits, all this cool stuff. So we would wheel these things around, and when I say wheel, I mean more like Ark of the Covenant.
Well,
like,
it's really real quick anecdote about that. Back in around that time, I forget the year exactly, but we had our facility, our audio partners had become one of the first places in the country to install an Atmos suite, right? And so awesome. We're good friends with your colleague Tom McAndrew on the audio side of things, and so they're like, yeah, well, why don't we do Dolby Vision too? And I remember your colleague Tom Graham called and said, hey, we want to do this event at your guys' studio. Here's what we need. I need 4 20 amp plugs in your room to plug the Pulsar in. And I was like, what? He goes, yeah, I just need 4 20 amp plugs right wherever we're going to plug them on. I'm like, Tom, I can't. I don't have that. Sorry, buddy. It was liquid cooled. The Ark of the Covenant. I like that analogy. It's exactly what it was like.
It was a behemoth. I think it weighs like 300 or 400 pounds. It's a lot.
Yeah, Robbie and I have both been in the presence of the Pulsar, fortunately for us, and God, what a cool display.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I almost, I think of it as a really good success. We didn't commercially, manufacture them, and we never really intended it to be that. It kind of served its purpose in the sense that we really wanted to use this display to showcase what HDR could look like, and we were hoping to spur the industry to create better, more streamlined displays and let the companies that are really good at commercial products like Sony, Canon, all these things take over. And I mean, look at where we are now, just not even 10
Yeah,
years.
totally. I mean, and that's why, I mean, the kind of the, you know, it was a technology demo, I guess, if you will, to show this. I mean, and thinking back on it now, it was very impressive because of its brightness, but it was HD only. The
Yeah.
power, the
Only
power,
accepted 12-bit. It was like super.
yeah,
super-
power draw was not going to get energy certification from anybody,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, all sorts of problems with it. So you know, as that started growing, as you started going around to these larger facilities, they started dabbling in, you know, HDR. That's kind of one side of the story, right? But the other side of the story is trying to convince, what you do day to day, is trying to convince partners, right? The Sonys, the FSIs, the Canons, whoever in the world, to in
Yeah.
one part, you know, invest in this technology and kind of make this technology. But the third part of that is also trying to get the content creators, the studios, the Netflix, etc., to also buy in a little bit. And, you know, I know some of that was a little bit before your time at Dolby, but like in a general sense, can you speak to, like, you know, what that probably that initiative was and kind of how it's developed now? Like, how do those conversations go now when you talk to people about integrating Dolby Vision into their you know, their workflows?
Yeah, no, it's great. Again, a great question. I think a lot of it spurred from, not only the availability of content creation tools like, color correctors that support it, reference displays that can do HDR, but I think the big breakthroughs also came when it became more available on the playback side, when people at
Mhm.
home could see it and realize like, oh, wow, that's way closer to what I saw on the grading suite than was previously, right? And I think that was kind of like the big aha moment. And then when you started to get more and more TV OEMs signing up and then more and more OTT platforms signing up, it almost just became natural. And from the creative standpoint, when talking to folks like yourself, I think it became easier when we had more robust ways and to show that, it does really, maintain your creative intent. And I think, I don't pretend to play a colorist, but I think, as a creative person, that is something that mantra really speaks a lot of volume, right? Because I would assume that when you guys spend hours, crafting your vision, you don't want it to go get stretched by all this other crazy crap that you have no
Oh
control
yeah.
over, right? At least vision gives you some sense of, you know,
Well,
consistent.
I mean, I think also, I mean, speaking for us personally, but I'm curious if you had the same, you know, perspective visiting places as well. Like in those early days of Dolby Vision, it was freaking complicated, right?
For sure.
Like,
Yeah.
we were at the time we were working with the external content mapping unit, the
Yep.
ECMU, right? Which was a whole
Hardware.
separate server, hardware server. You know, it was a 1U super micro that's still in a closet over here in the corner of my room right
Sure.
here.
We should give out ECMU licenses, by the way. I do that. People still have it.
You know, external CMU box that you had to get talking to your color corrector. You had to, you know, dive into command line, you know, very much so the making of Dolby Vision stuff, right? I'm talking about, you know, the deliverables, the XMLs and stuff like that was command line driven really through the professional tools. Not a whole lot of color correctors were supporting it in a way that made it easy to the end colors. Like it almost, Joey, tell me if you agree with this. Like it almost seemed in those early days, like you were kind of required to have an engineer on staff to make this stuff work.
Yeah, and I think that does make some sense, given, like you said, they wanted to, the first places that adopt it were big advanced facilities that had a little bit more engineering support behind them, which hopefully kind of leaves the teams at Dolby the flexibility to collaborate with the engineering side too and figure out the best way to integrate this into post-production and encoding pipelines. I was just going to mention, just to go back a little bit to the issue of creative intent and accuracy. That to me is one of the greatest things about PQ and Dolby Vision in particular is, yes, in the old SDR days, every consumer playback device was the complete wild, wild west. Now they've gotten so much closer together, I think largely because of Dolby Vision, but even to the point of theatricals, I will specifically seek out any movie in Dolby Cinema, half because I love the HDR and half because I know the projector's been calibrated this century.
Sure.
But so yeah, Robbie, I think you're absolutely right. The initial user facing tools for Dolby Vision were very technical, especially, you couldn't even make screeners, right? We dove into this very deeply, right?
we
had
yeah,
we
go
had a
ahead, Joey.
license for the Dolby encoding engine software, which is the only way to really make like encoded MP4s that could play back on consumer devices. And when we first got this, basically there's no user interface. It was designed for cloud computing platforms where you would write your own back end to control it. And that's great for streamers and studios because they're already doing that with their workflow teams. We actually had to write our own user interface for that to make our own Dolby encodes. And we were one of the first non-major studios to do it. And I remember, Robbie, I told you at the time, I was like, watch, we're putting all this work in and it's awesome and we're glad we're doing it. This will be a button in Resolve in 2 years. And it is now. And I think that's wonderful because we started out with everything being tested and operated on and figured out at the very highest end. And then it kind of evolves. All the kinks get worked out. Then it gets more and more presentable to the artist that doesn't have to have as much of a technical background. Yeah. Now you can make a very good Dolby Vision encoded screener MP4 right out of DaVinci Resolve without any kind of drama or difficulty. That wasn't always the case, but I think that was the logical approach to do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm remembering now, Joey, that I was when I spoke to Nate's colleague Tom Graham, who's a good friend of ours, and he had called and said, "Hey, do you want to try this?" I had written him about like, how do I create a Dolby Vision MP4 to give to a client? He's like, well, you could try out this software, but like, good luck, basically. I think initially when he gave us, when we got the license and we got the package to install, I think he was like, we'll see you in a couple years when you figure it out, right? And honestly, if it hadn't been for Joey, like in his computing knowledge and compiling knowledge and all that kind of stuff, it would have never happened. But it was kind of a little bit of defeat because, I mean, for a period of like 18 months, like Joey was literally the smartest guy on the planet outside of like the Netflix and the Amazon, pipelines in the world, because he had done this on a computer in his basement and he was making, it was a little deflating when it was like, oh yeah, that's just a one button now in Resolve, but that's a natural,
I welcomed it.
That's a natural evolution, I suppose. So, I think, we've covered a little bit of this. It makes a lot of sense that we started kind of at the high end, worked out the kinks. It's slowly filtered. And I remember kind of the very first sort of milestone point that this was going to be a bigger, wider thing for me was, DaVinci Resolve over the past decade or so has grown from this multi-$100,000 system into essentially a free system. There's a free version of it, right? But DaVinci Resolve Studio at whatever it is, $300, $400. I remember when the announcement came out that Dolby Vision was going to be natively supported in DaVinci Resolve Studio without any additional cost, meaning that you could make a compatible, say, Dolby Vision IMF with the free version of Resolve. And if you needed additional creative control, you could purchase a trim license, which gives you, you still can, by the way, still purchase that, gives you some additional creative control by enabling the trim controls in Resolve Studio. But when I saw that, I was like, well, now here we are, right? We've gone through trial by fire at the biggest places in the world. And now we have what is, I would have to guess, the most widespread color correction system in use in the world, now offering this for free. From your guys' perspective, at that point, if you can kind of remember back or think back or whatever, like, has it been an explosion of content since kind of, that point in time? It seems like it has to me anyway.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you've mentioned Tom several times already, but he has really great slides that he shows every time we do open houses and things like that, where the momentum is it's really exploding. Obviously, some big milestones, like you mentioned, on the creative side, but then also adoption from the OTT platforms, embracing it as the go-to HDR format. And then, again, our catalog of playback devices that are supporting it. And it always blows my mind, even as someone who works here and interfaces with this stuff every day. It's just like, the intersection now between all these different mediums for playback is so exciting. And I think that's, again, akin to all the research that we did up front. It's like, if you think of back in the day, it was like you watch stuff on like lamp-based projectors or CRTs at home, right? And now it's like you have OLEDs, LCDs, RGB OLEDs, QD OLEDs,
right,
dual layer, single layer LCDs, and it's like so many different backlight technologies, but then so many different, formats of like my phone, tablets, desktop PCs, like giant TVs, LED walls, like it almost like begged for this kind of format, right? Where it's like there's way too much going on. Like we need some sort of like hero set of pixels, if you will, to guide all of this together to form the creative vision in a way that is most, akin to that initial intent. And I think that's again part of the reason why we've seen a lot of success is because as that landscape evolves, it almost, beckons for this sort of kind of control from the creative side. So to your point, yeah, the momentum's been really awesome to see. I mean, I like sharing slides when I do my trainings, and even since I've joined in a few years, I think we were under 20,000 titles globally, and now we're well over 25. I think we're actually closer to 30 the last time I checked the numbers. So it's been really cool to see that and kind of get people like yourselves and others more directly involved is always really gratifying. And again, making
It's all,
everything
yeah. I mean,
more
it's also
accessible
interesting to
is
me.
exciting.
It's and you hinted on this, but it's also, I think, a good demarcation point for when a technology is succeeding is when it's literally in the hands of everybody, right? And what I mean by that is that, like, to me, in the past 5 6 7 years, the biggest endorsement of Dolby Vision in general was an iPhone or Android make whatever putting DV on mobile devices. Pretty
Yeah.
much everybody in the world has some flavor of a mobile phone. Many of them new can support Dolby Vision content, and I think that's an exciting part about it. And it's like, when I think of Dolby Vision in general, the way that I like to describe it to those who are uninitiated is it's a translation tool, right? It allows you to get similar experiences no matter the medium that you're viewing content on, right? Whether that be a 4,000 nit mastering display or whether that be your 300 nit, TV that you bought from Costco that's in your bedroom, right? Like, it doesn't matter. DV allows you to go between all of those kind of worlds seamlessly, getting a similar creative intent and a similar experience. Whereas we've talked about it, like, it's just, before it's like, well, this TV's bright, that TV's dark, this is unsaturated, that's desaturated.
And it's funny, you look at the SDR grading kind of world right now, and if you look at any user group, at any Facebook thing, anywhere, all anyone ever talks about is I open up my file in 3 different players and I pixel peep and it looks kind of wrong here and kind of wrong here, and people keep saying stupid things like gamma shift and other made up things that nobody ever figured this out for SDR.
Yeah.
On the software side and the playback side, right? It was never, ever even anywhere remotely solved with SDR. And with HDR and Dolby Vision, it is just miles ahead in terms of uniformity of creative intent and display across a wide variety of playback softwares, platforms, streaming services, devices, all across the board. And that, I think, is the most, as a colorist, that's the most exciting part, besides just that it looks awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the idea of like a closed loop ecosystem, right? Where, like, essentially now we have a situation where a colorist, a DP, and a producer or whatever sit in a suite in Los Angeles making a big, Disney Plus or Amazon show or whatever. They look at it and they go, okay, cool. Well, if we do our job right and produce this Dolby Vision metadata and the master content correctly, that we can then give that to whoever. And then when they push it out to the TV, it's actually the content telling the TV what to do and how to perform, right? And how to behave. That kind of closes that loop back to the mastering suite, where it's like, we now, content creators now have a fighting chance that their content that they make and they've spent blood, sweat, and tears and millions of dollars on is going to have a fighting chance of looking the way that they want it to when it ends up on Joe Smith's TV at home, right? And I think that's the first time that's really ever happened, which is super exciting.
100%. And I think you guys both just spoke about great points. A couple of misconceptions that we hear all the time is like, hey, will my $400 Dolby Vision TV make my TV look like a $30,000 reference monitor? And it's always like, no. But again, what that handshake is doing is that it's giving you confidence that that display will play back that content as good as it can physically, limited.
Well, that's why I said translation earlier, right? Is that
Right.
like, and I think it's one of the one thing, we can get geeky about this for a second, because translation, another way of saying that is a tone mapping, right?
Exactly.
And tone mapping is essentially getting the performance and display characteristics of one set of content or one display and translating that over to another display, right? So if you have, a 4,000 nit Rec 2020 master, how is that going to look on a 500 nit, PQ enabled television that you got at Costco? That's that translation, that tone mapping to get it to that performance. And yes, there are sacrifices. You're not going to make your $300 TV look like a $30,000 reference monitor, but for the first time, you have a fighting chance of getting it close, right? Which I think is
And perceptually close.
Perceptually close. Yeah. I think
Perceptually close. And you'll also say, right, is that, part of the thing that makes us, all of this possible is that we have, these great kits and these great engineers and scientists at Dolby that are working with all of our partners to make sure that, you have to go through testing to do Dolby Vision integration, and it's a proprietary ecosystem, which again, for those who are, less educated on the display side, for SDR, for example, every TV OEM has their own flavor of SDR. Like, yes, there is filmmaker mode and other things that help tremendously, but every manufacturer has their own special sauce, right? And it's very similar on the camera side, where it's like people would say all the time when I was at Canon, like, oh, I love Canon's color imagery. Like, I love the skin tones that I get on a Canon versus
color imagery should be color imagery, right?
Right. And again, that's where this kind of, I like your analogy of closed loop, is because we're trying to get rid of all of that and make it just, again, as close as you can perceptually to what you did in the mastering suite. And, the cool thing here is that I think, if you look at historically, I think we're as close as we've ever been as a unification, and it's only going to get better and better, which is.
And I'll say this: I've done some pretty extensive testing on a wide variety of, obviously, professional mastering displays, really good consumer displays, down to, I won't say bad, but I will say lower cost consumer displays. And just like you said, with SDR, the display does whatever the marketing people and the engineers at the TV company thought looked the best, right? It will do that to your image.
And that makes sense, right? To think of, like, if you think about it from the OEM standpoint, because it's like, I want to differentiate myself. Like,
yeah,
Sony.
But they also, and what I think a lot of people don't realize is these TVs also do the same thing with just straight PQ content or HDR10 content, right? They have a PQ image of 1,000 nits or 4,000 nits or whatever. They need to display it at their native 300, 400 nits. They will tone map that however that TV feels like doing it, with their own algorithm that will have whatever sauce that they like the best in it. And when it goes through the Dolby testing process to have the Dolby Vision technology in it, that mapping is dictated by the Dolby Vision standard and by the actual metadata encoded in the master. I've done A/B testing of the same content, straight PQ on lower cost consumer displays versus with Dolby Vision metadata, and it's night and day. Like, you might not see a drastic difference. You probably won't see any difference showing a 1,000 nit PQ image in Dolby Vision and at 1,000 nits on a 1,000 nit capable TV, because it's not doing any work, right? But then you take that to a lower cost display device that only does 300 or 400 nits. That closed loop that we're talking about, I mean, it is drastically better.
Yeah. I agree.
Night and day. Like, I would rather watch straight SDR than most consumer TVs PQ mapping that they do without Dolby Vision. The closed loop aspect of this ecosystem, I think, is completely key.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think just drawing attention to that is important too. I know, Robbie, like, you've seen some of the data that I've shown at NAB and some of our other trainings. There's a great site, Ardians.com. If you're ever curious about this, they do really extensive TV testing, but they'll actually provide numbers of what luminance levels these certain TV sets are stretching SDR to. And it's crazy to look at some of the times, because again, you think of SDR in your guys' world, that's 100 nits, right?
Right.
And some of these TVs
like 1,000 nits plus, right? Yeah.
Literally. From a filmmaker's point of view, again, like, I don't pretend to, live in your guys' world, but like, if that were me, that would be my worst nightmare, right? Because it's like, I spent all this time and now I have almost no control. Whereas like this, to your point, Joey, it's like, at least now you have a fighting chance, or faith that when you go from all these different mediums that we were talking about, not only like form factor, but different manufacturers, that it's going to be a lot more consistent than it would if you just left it up to them.
Well, guys, this conversation has been awesome so far, but I'm looking at my notes here and we still have a lot of things that we want to chat with Nate about. So I think what we should do is stop and make this a part 1, and we'll pick up with a part 2 in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. As always, I want to thank our sponsor, Flander Scientific. Without you guys, the show would not be possible. And I also want to thank Stella, our editor, who makes Joey and I sound intelligible. Stella, as always, thanks for your help. And of course, if you're checking the show out on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you find it, please like and subscribe to the show. Every like and every subscribe really helps us get the word out about the Offset podcast. But for now, thanks for watching.